Okay, hi, welcome back to the second half of this talk on navigating. I want to start this one by talking about stories and storytelling, something that's absolutely fundamental to our experience as humans, because as the writer Jonathan Haidt observes, we think in terms of stories. He says that the human mind is a story processor, not a logic processor. Stories are the things we use to make sense of who we are, of our place in the world, of where we're going. And they're also the things that create reality as much as they describe it. Because when we use stories to make sense of the world and we act accordingly, we then make them come true. A great example of this dynamic is what happens when you have a run on a bank. That's something that begins with a story circulating, that the bank doesn't have enough money to meet everybody's withdrawal requests. And if enough people believe the story and start to act accordingly, in this case by forming a queue outside a bank, just like happened here with Northern Rock during the global financial crisis, then the story becomes reality. And suddenly the bank actually doesn't have enough money to meet everyone's withdrawal requests. So stories are generative, they're not just descriptive. Now, in our work as change makers, three kinds of stories are especially important. This is a typology developed by the great Marshall Gans, a kind of legendary organizer in the United States who now teaches at Harvard. And he says that all change makers need to be clear on what are our stories of self, our stories of us, and our stories of now. And in the rest of this talk, we'll just look briefly at each of those three. So let's start first with stories of self. This is really about choosing the stories that we tell everyone else, and indeed ourselves, about who we are and why we do the work we do as change makers. Marshall Gans puts it like this: when you do public work, you have a responsibility to offer a public account of who you are, why you do what you do, and where you hope to lead. And this is really the kind of the basis for all of our work as change makers. And it's worth being really conscious and deliberate about, well, what is that story? Why do we do what we do? And also taking time to be mindful of areas where disempowering stories about ourselves may creep into our minds, because we also have the power to choose those consciously. And this point about choosing the stories that we use to make sense of the world also extends to the stories that we receive, that we take in to make sense of what's happening around us. I am constantly at risk of finding myself doom scrolling on my phone, where I'm almost kind of seeking out negative news stories to kind of feed some hunger I have for that. And it can be very debilitating, very disempowering. And I've learned the hard way that it's worth being quite mindful and deliberate about curating our news diet, and also about being careful with what we share online, which stories we're putting out there on social media, because again, they are generative. They have this raw creative power to them. Now, where it gets really interesting is where we get to the collective level of we and the stories of us that we tell as change makers. This is something I'm a little bit obsessed by. I wrote a book a few years back called The Myth Gap, which was all about the collective stories that we use as communities to make sense of the world. And one of the reasons that I find myths so interesting is that they're the very deepest kinds of shared stories. They're the ones that, if you like, provide our magnetic north. They tell us about what's important, what we value, what we stand for. And sometimes they may hold up a mirror to us, perhaps including the parts of ourselves that we might not want to look at too closely. Myths in their deepest form are very much a form of collective psychology at the societal level. And one of the ideas that the Myth Gap really got into and took its title from was the idea that we are quite distanced these days from a lot of the old stories, the old myths that we used to have as shared resources for understanding the world. In our fast-paced modern times, we tend to think things are either literally true in the scientific sense or not true at all. And the old deep myths have become quite remote from our everyday experience, leaving us with this gap between our busy modern lives and those old deep stories. And in this myth gap, the problem is that nature abhors a vacuum. And when you have this gap where the old stories used to be, the wrong kinds of shared stories can flow into that gap to take their place. Now, one example of what that can look like is the story that's been expertly propagated by the marketing industry ever since the 1920s, the story that you are what you buy. This is a very powerful shared story that, of course, is where the whole modern phenomenon of consumerism comes from. And in fact, now it's sometimes said that the only universal ritual that we all share in our societies is shopping. And that may be putting it a bit too far, but there's no denying the power of this shared story that we are what we buy. It determines so much of our actions every day. And in the political realm, of course, you have politicians like Donald Trump who really thrive on stories of them and us that talk about a threatening other and how perhaps we need to build bigger walls to keep that threatening other out. What's interesting about these stories is that they're very zero-sum. That means that if one side is winning, the other side has to be losing. So in these stories, what often is at the center of these stories is a sense that more status or power or opportunity for a disadvantaged group means less status, power, opportunity for more privileged groups. It's presented as this zero sum, someone has to win, so someone has to lose kind of game. It's perfect for whipping up othering. And in our work as larger us change makers seeking to bring people together rather than dividing them, it therefore becomes really important that we're telling stories of a larger us rather than a them and us. And again, going back to the same theme, these are positive sum rather than zero sum stories. So the stories that we might tell about racial justice, for example, are that this isn't a situation where as one side wins, another side loses. On the contrary, it's that more opportunities, more rights, more justice for historically disadvantaged groups is something that benefits everybody. It's a rising tide that lifts all boats. These are the stories that we need to be putting out there into the world. And I think one of the aspects of that that's especially interesting is that we also, in doing so, need to be telling stories of how unity and diversity are not at odds, but in fact are two sides of the same coin. It's so striking that whenever we see culture wars erupt on contentious issues, you often see one side focusing very much on trying to enforce unity and conformity and oneness and sameness. Think back to the authoritarians that we saw in Karen Stenner's work back in the first week, and how they have this very strong need for kind of shared moral order and a preference for kind of oneness and sameness. So we often find them on one side of those culture war debates. And on the other side, progressive activists calling them out, saying that their preference for oneness and sameness is at odds with the diversity that progressive activists often value in society. And then you end up with these culture war dynamics. But I think in some ways, the story we need to be telling is that cherishing diversity in all of its different forms is not at odds with the unity that the authoritarians seek, that actually there's the potential there for a beautiful synthesis between the two. And I think a great metaphor of what this can look like is the example of a rainforest. If you think of the Amazon basin, for example, what you have there is absolutely astonishing diversity of all the different species that make up that ecosystem. But there's also a fundamental unity. It is an ecosystem that coheres, that is created through all of that diversity. The unity and the diversity are not in tension. On the contrary, it's the diversity that enables the unity. And that's always struck me as an incredibly powerful story. So finally, what about the world level? What about the stories of now that we need to be telling, of this moment that we're living through? As we've touched on all through this series of talks, we're living through an age of crisis where there's so much disruption and breakdown and upheaval happening all around us. And in those moments, the need for shared stories becomes especially acute because, again, as I said before, stories can so easily become self-fulfilling prophecies. And it really matters, therefore, that we pick the right kinds of stories to make sense of this age of crisis, because those stories will in turn frame our actions. Now, you'll remember the first half of this graph from the last talk showing that stylized version of the emotional stages that societies often go through in the wake of a big disaster. And the good news here is that after that long process of disillusionment that I talked about before, what typically happens is that societies enter a reconstruction phase, a feeling of a new beginning. And what's happening in this reconstruction phase is that communities or societies are recovering a sense of agency. They're starting to rebuild, to make sense of what's happened, but also to rekindle hope for the future. And a key point here is that it's shared stories that really allow that process of reconstruction to happen. There's a kind of essential element of making sense of the disaster, but also of the possibility of a new future. And in psychological terms, that reconstruction phase has a lot in common with the idea that psychologists call post-traumatic growth. And this is a relatively new idea in psychology, but one that's become very influential. And it's about the idea that when individuals or communities undergo and go through an experience of trauma, it's possible to recover and heal from trauma in ways that unlock powerful kinds of growth. Richard Tedeschi, who's one of the kind of pioneers in this space, puts it like this, that when individuals or societies experience post-traumatic growth, people develop new understandings of themselves, of the world they live in, how to relate to other people, the kind of future they might have, and a better understanding of how to live life. A key point here is that when we heal from trauma, when we enter this period of post-traumatic growth, if that's what happens, we're not just healing in the sense of going back to exactly how we were before. That doesn't happen. We come back different, changed by the experience of trauma, but also potentially with these new capacities that Richard Tedeschi is talking about here. And part of these shared experiences of post-traumatic growth can be developing new myths. And indeed, when you look back at the long sweep of human history, one of the really fascinating things is how often periods of immense turbulence and breakdown can be very fertile soil for the emergence of new myths. So to take one example, think of China's Warring States period from about 900 to about 200 BCE, a period of total catastrophe and breakdown over and over again, but also a time of extraordinary mythic renewal in China. This was the period that Confucianism and Taoism emerged from, two philosophies that are still with us today, 2,500 years later. Or think of Europe's experience during the Black Death, another experience of complete cataclysm, where up to a third of the population was lost in some places. But this was also the soil that produced the Renaissance and later the Reformation and the Enlightenment. Again, this profound renewal of our deepest shared stories from that experience of collective loss. And within our own living memory, of course, there's the experience of World War II, the horrors of the Holocaust, of the first use of an atomic bomb, of the enormous millions of people that died in that conflict. But again, the renewal that emerged from that included new institutions like the United Nations. So what about us today as we enter this period of crisis and look for our own forms of renewal? What kind of stories might be involved there? Well, one way that I like to think about this is of imagining humanity as being like a single individual and asking ourselves, what stage might we be at? If we were a single individual, would humanity be a baby, a child, a teenager, an adult, or someone in their senior years? And this is a question that the writer Dwayne Elgin has for years liked asking audiences all over the world when he does talks. He'll invite them to consider this question. And typically the answer he will get back from between 2/3 and 3/4 of any given audience is that humanity is living through its teenage years. This seems to make some kind of instinctive, intuitive sense to us of humanity being in its teenage years as a species. And for Dwayne Elgin, this makes a lot of sense, because as he observes, most teenagers don't become adults without moving through a time of testing and challenge, a rite of passage. But he goes on, I believe the human family is about to go through a time of profound initiation and challenge, as we move from our adolescence to our adulthood. So what you have there is this idea that as we're living through our species adolescence, we're undergoing this time of testing and challenge. But it's also, as with kind of initiation ceremonies in indigenous societies all over the world, these testing rites, these thresholds, are the opportunity for us to enter our adulthood as a species with all of the kind of responsibilities and opportunities for co-creation that entails. So that for me is one possible shared myth that can allow us to make sense of this moment, particularly as we enter this difficult period with so much challenge and shared loss involved. But I think also with tremendous hope for what may lie on the other side of this age of crisis, and finally growing up as a species into what we were always meant to be. So that's the end of this series of talks on Larger Us change-making. If you're interested in finding out more about Larger Us's work, you can do so at our website, www.larger.us. That's got details of how to sign up for our mailing list, of events we're going to be organizing in the future, and other ways of getting more involved in our community. Thanks so much for watching these talks.